Our next speaker is Dee Hu. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so honored to be here among so many wonderful scholars. I love the warm community here, so thank you so much, Ruben and Scott, Leah and Em, for helping bring me here. And today, I want to explore some of the kind of the beginnings of new research that I'm doing. So, I would love to discuss with everyone what you think and questions about this research. Okay. All right. So the big questions of that I'm love to grapple with are, why do legal identity categories such as race, why do they exist when they do not map onto biological realities? And how do people practice and embody these, their identities in ways that contradict such legal categories? So today, I will talk about the Spanish colonial empire, and specifically in the Andes of South America. So first I'll talk about the racialized identity categories of the regime. I'll also go into a little bit more about what their policies of social segregation and prohibiting and prescribing inter-caste interaction. I'll also talk about the behavioral expectations that are tied to such identity categories. I'll talk about what my research agenda is and how I'm interrogating such categories. And I'm also talking about like how maybe other people, and as like historians and also people in the past, the Spanish themselves, if we take what they say at face value, there are some dangers to doing so. It could lead us to interpretations that are reinforcing these regimes that uphold white supremacy, that uphold genocide. And then I'll talk about how these schemes, these top-down schemes, legal identity schemes, were subverted in legal settings by native Andean, indigenous Andean claimants and defendants, and show that these schemes failed, and in part because the assumptions that they made, these behavioral expectations that they had, made them fundamentally fragile. So in a way, they sowed the seeds for their own destruction. Okay. All right. So the theoretical framework I'm trying to work through and adopting, I call it normative identity performance. It's a theory that's inspired by Caretha Mitchell's Know Your Place aggression theory, and it's also relevant to Judith Butler's analysis of gendered normative identity performance, this idea that there are these expectations that society has that most people share about what a certain intersectional identity should act as, and that if people of those identities do not perform what's expected of them, then there is a threat response. So my work focuses on how people resist this kind of framework. So often people will try to mitigate this threatening response by performing the subordinate identity expectations. So, theories like stereotype threats fall under this category. But if everybody performed these roles at face value of what society expects, the result is that white supremacy is supported, right? Because this is a system that upholds white supremacy, and when people perform at face value what's expected of them, it reproduces the system that created these hierarchical, racialized schemes. But I will show that for indigenous Andeans, and I'm sure this happened everywhere, is that they mime these roles, these expectations in legal settings, in their language, but not in their actions, which actually subverted these legal prescriptions of inter-caste interactions. And that these interactions, right, stemming from hundreds, if not thousands of legal cases, would actually build up these long-term networks of political cooperation and cultural exchange that eventually helped topple the Spanish colonial empire. So it was actually something that they used and turned on its head, right, to kind of topple this system. All right. Okay. So, during the Spanish colonial empire, there was, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with castas, right? It's the Spanish word for caste, and they had this system of racialized identities, but it wasn't the same throughout the whole time period. So during Habsburg rule, from 1516 to 1700, this was still kind of operating under like older understandings of identity and status, that it was a legal system that wasn't very rational, meaning standardized. So it was a legal system that was just made up of all these exceptions, right? People would petition for privileges. They would petition and say, we helped, right, the Spanish conquistadors defeat the Inca, therefore we should be exempt from tax burdens and things like that. And so it was based on costumbre, which was, custom, the customary ways of how things are done on the ground, responsive to the local relational histories, rather than this idea of a top-down, biologically based idea of race. That changed when you had the Bourbons come in, and they were, very much embody this Enlightenment ideal. And this rise of a biologically based racial ideology. So the legal system was rationalized, it was against exceptions. So if you, belong to what they consider like a natural biological caste, then everything was determined, including what your moral character was, including your behaviors, your propensity towards violence. All of those things were predetermined by your so-called racial caste that you were born into, right? And these paintings, these casta paintings, which showed what you would call people given certain mixes of different racialized categories, these casta paintings proliferated in the 18th century, specifically under the Bourbon rule. Okay. And the Spanish, took these policies, and they, they had this idea that everything bad resulted from people of different racialized castes interacting with each other, whether it be intermarriage or, interactions like in pulquerias, in taverns, in market spaces, that these were considered dangerous by the Spanish, mainly because they thought, well, this is when people get up to no good, they become rebellious, they start to become criminals once people start mixing, especially other castes mixing with the indigenous caste, right? They thought that indigenous peoples were very passive. They thought that indigenous peoples were very passive unless they were put up to violence and rebellion by people from other castes, especially mestizos and other Spanish. These policies of segregation also involve things like pitting people from different so-called racialized castes against each other. So in labor settings, they would put, for example, enslaved people of African descent in positions to mete out physical punishment. So yes, it was the Spanish or mestizo administrators ordering the enslaved Africans to do this, but the result was to foster this animosity and pit different groups against each other when you put them into this hierarchy. There was also a paternalistic assumption of indigenous passivity. So you can see, this is what the Spanish thought of the men, right? Every adjective that you can, negative adjective that you can think of. And there's this idea that they were passive unless they became drunk or in the company of people from other castes, right? That other castes had agency to put them up to whatever the thing that the Spanish administrators and law officials didn't like, but on their own, they couldn't possibly think of doing these things. They thought that the women were humble and hardworking, and they thought that everybody was timid, melancholic, and born to serve, and that they needed the protection and guidance from superiors, from the protector of the natives, right? It was a legal office to give them justice, that they were like children that needed protection from, the big bad people from the other castes. And women, especially indigenous women, were assumed to be especially passive victims and without agency. And they were often depicted as victims of abuse and exploitation in colonial art and literature. So you can see, the two paintings are from Casta paintings, right, showing Native women sort of being abused. And there was kind of a hierarchy that the Spanish assumed of who had the most propensity towards violence against indigenous women. So they thought that people from the Negro caste, the black caste, had the most propensity towards violence. And then you have Espanol, right, Spanish, the Mestizo, and then the last Indio, because they thought Native men had the least agency, that they were most passive among the male categories. So my research question is, how are these racial tropes that they lived with, that people lived with, how are they used in court? So I'm interested in the gap between the legal ideology and the social reality, the gap between Spanish understandings of indigeneity and emic understandings, so what the indigenous native Andeans thought themselves of what it meant to be indigenous or to be native. Okay. And so far, I found there's a lot of contradictions between law and social reality. So you have these laws that enforce or aim to enforce separation, right, among people from different racialized castes. And these identities themselves, right, are not as stable as the Spanish in the written documents make it seem. But this is the scheme that they put forward versus what people were actually doing on the ground. So these legal cases would activate cross-caste alliances on either side. So you can see people using these tropes, right, saying, so if you're a native claimant saying, oh, the people of African descent are abusing us, under the behest of this Spanish business person, right? And we need your protection because we are defenseless and we are humble and we have no recourse, so please help us. But then if you look at the witnesses who are supporting these native claimants, they are literally people from other so-called racialized castes. So they're actually activating these alliances that cross-cut these castes, and the Spanish colonial economy, it was necessary to have social mixing in order for the economy to work. So the reason why you have these proscriptions is not because people didn't do them, is because people kept doing them and did that a lot, right? So what we see is that the laws and what's written down is the frustration of the Spanish, government in keeping in practice, enforcing in practice what their racial scheme was on paper. So that's why you have all these royal decrees, year after year saying the same thing and threatening, sanctions, but they'll just have the same royal decree year after year because nobody followed them. And there are dangers of taking what is written uncritically. So the white Spanish interpretations of they interpreted the rebellion of Tupac Amaru II in 1781, which was the largest indigenous-led rebellion in the Americas, where over 100,000 people unfortunately perished during this rebellion. And also the Tupac Katari and Tomas Katari rebellions in Upper Peru, which is what is now Bolivia, right? And those rebellions were inspired by the Tupac Amaru rebellion. So the white Spanish interpretations, like contemporary of that time, they said they are rebelling because they are basically like feral, they're wild, and that the only motivation that they have is when they see white skin, they want to exterminate white people, right? Those are their words. So they interpreted these things as genocide. And unfortunately, some historians have taken those words at face value and portrayed the people who rebelled, who are not just indigenous Andeans, but also mestizos, Spanish, people of African descent, as the perpetrators of genocide rather than the victims of long-standing genocide. So it reproduces the Spanish colonial biases and racial logic if we take the words at face value and not examine what people do rather than what people say and write. Okay. So far the literature has focused on the elite motivations of people during these rebellions. So, people like Tupac Amaru II and his elite networks. So their motivations are because they want to defend their traditional privileges that come from costumbre, and the Bourbon regime, wanted to get rid of those. That it didn't matter that you were of a noble lineage, you were in the Indio caste, therefore you should not have any privilege, right? It was a racialized ideology that was more modern in a sense. But what's missing from this conversation is, why did the vast majority of ordinary people join these rebellions? How were they mobilized? Right? They didn't have those privileges to begin with. Why did they join? So in the case of someone named Pablo Chalco, his mother, Maria Sisa, and Petrona Conchari, they were from the Quechua ethnic group, and they were local leaders in the Tupac Amaru rebellion, but they were not elites. Right, so this gives us an insight into what their local motivations were, and what we saw is actually the bottom-up motivations were of this Inca utopia. Right, they believe that Tupac Amaru was kind of like King Arthur, the once and future king, a rebirth of Atahualpa, who had his head chopped off, and that he would come back in this myth of Inkari, that he was the embodiment of this once and future king that would be resurrected and come back. And so it was this messianic movement grounded in native cosmopolitanism that cut across different ethnic lines. Right, that was, at least under the Inca period, very pronounced. And this was a message of prosperity and ritual agency that was based on domestic fertility practices, and it was not based on racialized caste identity. And in the documents, we see an interesting description of the ritual bag that the mother and the wife had. And it just shows, like, this is the materiality of resistance for ordinary people, right? It wasn't about noble lineage, but it was about this, bottom-up groundswell of movement that was inspired by these long-term fables of things becoming just, this overturning of the world order to a more just world order where everybody could be prosperous. And it was not based on race. So why are these bottom-up interactions so important? I think they are key to understanding the wars of independence and how the Spanish colonial empire was defeated in the Americas, specifically in South America. So it's commonly assumed that the people who were mobilized, right, the vast majority of people who were mobilized to fight, that they were mobilized simply because their leaders, who were mostly of European descent, or Europeans themselves, like this picture is of General William Miller, an Englishman, that it was because they were just so charismatic, right? And that they would just naturally fall in line because they were patriots, or just that, their motivations are just ignored. You don't need explanation. They're passive. Of course, they would be in awe of these white leaders. But these foot soldiers in the historical documents are unnamed except for a group called the Morochucos. In the popular imagination, they're cast as bearded mestizo or white cowboys and muleteers, whose primary language is Quechua, which is an indigenous language. And their traditional homelands was in Vilcashuaman province, in the highlands of Peru, which is a very indigenous area even today, where the vast majority of people consider themselves of indigenous descent and speak Quechua. And this group, what we see is that, no, they weren't mostly people who were phenotypically lighter skinned, that the vast majority was from the so-called Indio caste. If you read the documents carefully, the local documents, and do the demographic analyses of the censuses at the time. And even more interestingly, this group was actually a conglomeration of diverse peoples across all the major castes. But what they shared in common was the shared political aims, right, of overturning this Bourbon-style order of government. And they shared cultural practices. Most notably, they spoke Quechua. That was their native tongue. So you had, people who presented as Spanish were very light-skinned, a beard, and blue eyes, who couldn't speak Spanish, that they could only speak Quechua. And their foodways were also indigenized and had Afro-Peruvian influences. In the historical documents, people do talk about Morochuco men, right? Like this guy, Basilio Auqui. But the role of women has kind of been neglected. In the historical documents, in the archival record, I was able to find many instances of Native women of the Morochuco homeland organizing and forcefully rebelling. So not only were they not passive, but they were actually, taking on physically against agents of the state. Okay. And because of these sexist biases of Native women being passive and harmless, that made the Spanish underestimate the resistance from these women, especially those who were the Morochucas. And it was not only these forceful actions that contributed to the toppling of the Spanish colonial empire, because the Morochucos were the main fighting force in the last decisive battle for South America at the Battle of Ayacucho. But they also did a lot of the cultural work over generations. They indigenized the common shared culture, and it explains why so many different so-called racialized castes, they shared kinship networks, they shared similar foodways, and they spoke Quechua. Right? So that explains this very curious cultural phenomenon now. So in conclusion, these Enlightenment social projects were thwarted by indigenous peoples in the Andes. Future research, I want to know how, what the statistical patterns are. How often were these tropes used? Did their use increase, decrease, or stay the same through time? And I also want to know the afterlives, right, of using this kind of trope. Because spatial and social projects of the Enlightenment actually accelerated after the height of the Enlightenment. Things like rational legal order, this rising concept of biologically based race, this idea of naturalized race, that it's a natural category. And what effects did this have on indigenous claimants and defendants in court? So far, I just have one document because it was a topic of my dissertation. But in 1841, where the indigenous claimants of this village complained against the administrator for abuse and violating the law, and they gave a very good legal account, very confident account, and the judge sided with the administrator, saying, because you are Indians, it doesn't matter what the administrator does. The administrator can only be punished if he breaks a law, he breaks a contract with the owners of this hacienda, with the nuns of Santa Clara, right, who were also of Spanish descent. So it became this like naturalized racial logic rather than something that was based on custom. Okay, so my questions for the audience is what kinds of social interactions do the legal identity categories of your state, country, or political community promote versus proscribe? And in what ways do people embody or transgress the logic of these identity categories? So thank you all very much. Yeah, I was very nervous, but the smiling faces in the audience helped me push through.
Dee, I'm going to say what maybe many of our students say in a classroom, which is, why didn't I know about this before? Like, I have a feeling of anger and indignation. So thank you. That's an amazing history that I want to know more about. I also was curious about, is there any relationship or connection between what sounds like a really interesting and large-scale rebellion in Peru in 1781 and the Haitian Revolution in 1791? Are there any documents that go back and forth? Is there a relationship, or are they just independent uprisings?
Yeah, so in the colonial documents, the Spanish administrators were principally concerned about the French Revolution and how that would affect things. But the French Revolution, happened after 1781. But they were afraid that the Tupac Amaru Rebellion and the French Revolution would give, further fire to things that happened later, which, they were right about that, right? It did. They never mentioned the Haitian Revolution, and I think it's because of this assumption that even though they saw the effects, right, that this assumption that people who were Black could not have the political agency to do what they did. So it was just so unthinkable, such cognitive dissonance, that they couldn't even admit to themselves that this movement could inspire, people in the Americas, right, people in South America. But I am sure that they were aware of what happened in Haiti. If you look at the composition of the rebel army, quite a lot of them, at least 10%, were people of African descent. And they came from the coast, and they went up to the highlands, where the indigenous were the majority, and they joined up for this. So on the coast, they know all the news of what's happening all around the world, right? This is why the Spanish government leaders were worried about the French Revolution, because they said everybody in every tavern, they're posting lampoons, they have whispers of rebellion. But they just wouldn't admit that the Haitian Revolution was also talked about. But I would not doubt that they knew about it.
Hi, thanks. Thank you so much. This talk was so amazing. And I'm really interested in sort of the cross-section of people who were involved in this rebellion. And when you said that there was sort of a group of white-appearing people, do you know if there's any sort of more information about that? Because I imagine that would be visually confusing to the Spanish to see people who are essentially, presenting as white and then trying to kill them. So I was just kind of curious about that.
So this is the group, the Moro Chucos, right? That they have a lot of people to this day who speak Quechua, ride around in horses, and have blue eyes, but they see themselves as indigenous. And we do have documents from that era where they interview Morochuco leaders and people who were involved in the rebellion. And they said, we are really surprised because we need a translator. We assumed they could speak Spanish, but they have a lot of difficulty speaking Spanish. So we need, a Quechua, someone who knows Quechua fluently, because otherwise we cannot get this information out of them. So it was also very arresting to the administrators, the Spanish colonial regime, state actors at that time. So yeah, they couldn't believe it either. Right? So it was kind of like all these things were happening, under the surface, that they could see things happening, but because they had this mental template of how the world worked and who was capable of agency and which way the agency went, right? They believed that the Spanish culture was strong and that people would assimilate into that. They just could not, it was just invisible to them and unthinkable to them that it could go the other way around, that, people could be indigenized. Yes. Scott?
Thank you so much, Dee. This is wonderful. It answered a long question I've had about casta paintings, where I noticed in the earlier ones where they're fascinated with indigenous hierarchy and royal families of the Inca and things like that. That made sense. But I'd never understood why, as they got into the 18th century, and now you've explained it beautifully with the costumbre, there's a switch to racial typing that becomes narrative in the paintings themselves. At first, the early ones, they're just like samples of people of color. They're not doing anything, they're static. And then later you have mulata looking in a mirror as her kitchen's on fire, or a child sleeping while mestizo child sleep while the animals get out of the barn. And they're always very narrative and like little moral stories. So thank you, because I've never understood that part of it. One of the things I'm interested in when you were just talking about the Mocharo?
Yeah, Morochuco.
Morochuco. I had the opportunity to be in Bolivia a few years ago in Coroico, where there's a large Afro-Bolivian community, which identifies as indigenous. I was thinking of their earlier talk as well. They speak Aymara, they dress in the traditional Cholo Andia outfit, and all their songs and everything are highly inflected by African music, because they brought that with them as escaped slaves from Brazil. And so these migrations and everything that we've all been talking about these last 2 days have my head spinning in the best of ways.
Yeah, and you can see it in the food too, in
Yeah,
the highlands. There are a lot of stewed dishes that draw from African logics.
So this is just beautiful. Thank you for this.
Yeah, but it's all invisible, right? Until you actually look at the data and can see, as long as you're not operating with the Spanish logic, that you can see things that were, hitherto just invisibilized, or just people are not seeing it. So yeah, it's just fascinating. I did not intend to study the Morochucos, but I had a question about how did people lose ethnonyms, right? All these different ethnic groups that used to exist in this province, nobody calls themselves by those ethnonyms anymore. How did that change? And then it led to this, and I never thought it had anything to do with the independence of South America, but here we are.
Thank you. This is wonderful work. I want to echo Ayana's point of, I'm angry I don't know this history and that I'm learning it, but also really grateful to learn it. I have sort of two things. One, I'm wondering if you've worked with Charles Mills and the idea of the racial contract.
Oh, no, I haven't.
That might be really interesting for you, just thinking about how race was constructed through legal means, but also how that constructs whiteness. I was really thinking about it when you had that one slide where they're describing indigenous men and they repeat liars, which I thought was really interesting just because it gets at exactly what Charles Mills talks about in terms of making a contract with someone, but then because you're not perceiving them as fully human, you don't have to follow through on that contract. But what I want to ask you about is legacies of this work. So in my context, we have an Indian Act in Canada. We have the RCMP as a legacy of the Riel Rebellion. So we still live very much in a world where indigeneity and caste are legally defined by the federal government, and we all just kind of pretend that this is a normal thing.
Yeah.
America has similar collections of laws. What are the contemporary legal ramifications of this history, if there are any?
Yeah, so it was unfortunate that after independence, these Enlightenment tropes actually matured. So the white leaders, they gave privileges to white morochucos and mestizo morochucos, but they completely erased the vast majority of morochucos who, fought for independence. And this unfortunately existed in this kind of like feudal state until maybe the 1960s when the indigenous villagers of the Highland Andes, they became aware of like all the communist revolutions that were going around in the world. So there were like a lot of communist-inspired movements, and unfortunately, one of them did lead to the Shining Path, this Maoist movement that was, pretty devastating for a lot of communities. But in the '60s, it was this like awareness of these international movements, and they used this groundswell of support for things like the agrarian reform that gave land back to the native communities, took it from the hacienda owners, gave it back to native communities, and that's what they're living with now is the result of the agrarian reform. What's interesting is that maybe in the last 20 or so years, there's this revindication of indigeneity in Peru, where I once did a survey, 20 years ago, in this village in this area, and I asked people, who are your ancestors? And the older generation would say, my grandparents or my great-grandparents. But then the younger generation said, Manco Capac, right, which is the first Inca emperor, right, that they identified as Inca. And that's in part due to like a changing emphasis in the education system, where they're also now learning Quechua again in the schools, whereas before, parents would tell their kids, don't speak Quechua. We're not going to speak Quechua to you. So they could understand Quechua, but they couldn't speak it because they thought that it would mark them for discrimination. But now things are changing, that it's become a revindication of that heritage. So yeah, it's not linear. Things go back and forth.
Hello. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. You made me think about a moment in the past when I was studying a little bit of Bartolomé de las Casas. And the first time I approached the text in Historia Sumaria, I was really interested in the ways in which he was talking about indigenous women. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is a way earlier period of time, but I'm curious if you could speak more about how early would you see, like in the colonial record, this awareness of the agency of women and how they would be performing agency in different ways beyond like domestic tasks and things like that? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Bartolomé de las Casas was kind of an exception to this time period because all the other treatises at this time period denied the fundamental humanity of indigenous peoples, and Bartolomé de las Casas kind of went against the grain in that way. On the ground, what we see in like early colonial period, maybe from like 1830s to 1550s, what we see is that since all the Spanish were men, almost all of them were men, especially in the highlands, they indigenized because they would marry the noble women, the indigenous women of the different villages, And then they would live as indigenous caciques in those villages. So they had these obligations to the community, right? So they established costumbre that, these customary ways of both, protection and exploitation at the same time, right? Of the people who are under you. So they took these customary things that actually originated in the Inca times and continued that. So if you look at the documents of like who was doing the contracts, right? Who was deciding, which son would get certain lands? They were the cacicas. They were the indigenous wives who were doing the work because they had the network. They had the social networks to command that relational wealth to that political power. And the husband was kind of just like the figurehead for, the Spanish system, right? But it was actually the women who were doing all of the work and making the political decisions. At least early on, things changed a little. You had in the 1550s, these local Spanish caciques rebelled against the crown, and then they were put down. But yeah, they thought, they went fully native and tried to, overturn the colonial system at that early age because they thought it was in their interest that they were now the lords. They were country bumpkins from like Andalusia, and now they're, a nobility, right? Indigenous nobility. So they wanted to preserve that power, and they plugged into these nativist movements about overturning the world order to have a more just world order. So that's all these little histories that we don't. It's not in the canon, so to speak, but they're there.
Dee, thank you so much.
Thank you.